The window shattered before Claire Bennett even understood what was happening. Rain and glass flew across her small kitchen, and a hand closed around her arm before she could scream. Lightning cracked outside, and in that flash of white light, she saw a man in a soaked black coat standing in her doorway, his eyes hard, his voice sharper than the storm. "You are a midwife. You are coming with me now." Claire tried to pull away, but his grip did not loosen. Another man appeared behind him, taller, with a scar along his jaw, and he was already reaching for her medical bag on the counter, the one she kept packed for emergencies. She had delivered dozens of babies in this town. She had never once been taken from her home in the middle of the night by strangers who looked like they belonged in nightmares. "Let go of me," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady, even as her heart pounded. "I have not done anything wrong." "This is not about what you did," the man in the coat said. "It is about what you can do. A woman is dying. You are the only person who can stop it." Something in his voice made her stop struggling. It was not just command. There was fear buried under the anger, fear he was trying hard to hide. Claire had heard that same tone before, from husbands standing outside delivery rooms, from mothers watching their daughters in pain. Whatever was happening, it was real, and someone's life truly hung in the balance. "Fine," she said, "but you will not drag me like a prisoner. Let me walk." He released her arm, and for a moment their eyes met. His were dark, almost black, filled with a storm of their own. Then he turned and walked out into the rain, without waiting to see if she would follow. She grabbed her bag and ran after him, because whatever this was, someone needed her, and she had never once turned her back on that call. The car ride was fast and silent. Claire sat in the back seat, water dripping from her hair onto the leather, watching the city blur past through rain-streaked windows. The scarred man drove like the road belonged to him, taking corners that made her stomach lurch. The man in the black coat sat beside her, jaw tight, staring straight ahead, saying nothing. "What is your name?" she finally asked, because the silence was worse than the fear. He glanced at her, surprised, as if no one had asked him something so simple in a long time. "Damien," he said, "Damien Cross." "And the woman who is dying, Damien, who is she to you?" His jaw flexed. "My brother's wife, Ivy. She is having the baby early. Something is wrong. The doctor we usually use is 2 hours away because of the flooding, and the hospital will ask questions we cannot answer tonight." Claire understood then, or thought she did. These were men who lived outside the normal world, men who could not simply walk into an emergency room without consequence. She did not know exactly what Damien Cross did for a living, but the guns she had glimpsed under his coat, and the tension radiating from every man in this car told her enough. "You should have called an ambulance regardless," she said. "A life is a life." "You do not understand," Damien said quietly. "If we call an ambulance, men will follow that ambulance. Men who want my family dead. Tonight, of all nights, we cannot bring more danger to her door." The car swerved into a long driveway lined with dark trees bent sideways by the wind. A large house rose ahead of them, its windows glowing gold against the black sky, but even from the car, Claire could hear it. A woman's scream, raw and desperate, cutting through the storm like a blade. She did not wait for the car to fully stop. She threw open the door and ran through the rain toward the house, her bag clutched to her chest, years of instinct taking over where fear had been a moment before. Inside, chaos greeted her. 2 men paced the hallway, useless, wringing their hands. An older woman knelt beside a couch, where a young pregnant woman writhed in pain, her face pale, her lips nearly blue. Blood had soaked through the blanket beneath her. "Move," Claire said, and something in her voice made every person in that room step back immediately. She knelt beside Ivy, checking her pulse, her breathing, the position of the baby, all in seconds, the way years of practice had trained her hands to move faster than her fear. "She has been like this for almost an hour," the older woman said, her voice shaking. "We did not know what to do." "How far along is she?" 8 months. The baby was not due for another few weeks. Claire's hands worked quickly, checking for the signs that mattered most. The bleeding was concerning, but not yet fatal. The baby's position was wrong, turned in a way that was making the labor far more dangerous than it needed to be. She needed light, hot water, clean cloths, and calm, none of which currently existed in this room full of panicking men. "I need everyone except her to leave," Claire said, nodding toward the older woman. "Now, and someone bring me hot water and every clean towel in this house." Damien appeared in the doorway, water still dripping from his coat, his eyes locked on Ivy's face. "Is she going to be all right?" "I do not know yet," Claire said honestly, because lying to calm him would not help either of them. "But I need you and everyone else out of this room so I can work." Standing there is not helping her. For a moment, he did not move. Then something shifted behind his eyes, some silent decision, and he stepped back through the door, pulling it half shut behind him but staying close enough that Claire could hear his footsteps pacing outside. The next hour blurred into instinct and adrenaline. Claire talked Ivy through every contraction, her voice calm even as her hands moved with practiced urgency. She repositioned the baby with careful, steady pressure, ignoring Ivy's cries of pain because stopping now would be far more dangerous than continuing. The older woman, whose name Claire learned was Marta, proved a quick and steady helper once given clear instructions, boiling water and passing towels without hesitation. "You are doing so well," Claire told Ivy, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The baby is turning, we are almost there." "I need one more big push when I tell you." Ivy nodded, tears streaming down her face, exhaustion written into every line of her body. Outside, thunder rolled low and long, and somewhere in the house, Claire heard a door slam, followed by low voices arguing in tense, urgent tones. She forced herself to block it out. Nothing mattered right now except the 2 lives in front of her. "Now," Claire said. "Push now." Ivy screamed, gripping Marta's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. And then, cutting through the storm and the chaos and the fear, came a new sound entirely. A baby's cry, thin and furious, and absolutely alive. Claire felt her own eyes fill with tears as she worked quickly to make sure both mother and baby were stable, the exhaustion of the last hour finally catching up to her hands. "It's a girl," she said, wrapping the baby in a clean towel and placing her gently on Ivy's chest. "She is small, but she is strong, just like her mother." Ivy laughed and cried at the same time, pressing her lips to her daughter's forehead. "Thank you," she whispered to Claire. "Thank you, thank you." The door opened fully then, and Damien stepped inside, his eyes going straight to Ivy and the small bundle in her arms. Claire watched something in his face break open, years of careful control cracking under the weight of relief. He crossed the room and knelt beside the couch, pressing a kiss to Ivy's forehead. "You scared us," he said, his voice rough. "Both of you." "She is beautiful," Ivy whispered. "Damien, she is here." He looked at the baby for a long moment, something almost soft passing over his features, before his eyes lifted and found Claire's across the room. She was standing now, her hands finally still, blood on her sleeves, exhaustion in every line of her body, and yet he looked at her the way men rarely looked at anyone. "You saved them," he said quietly. "Both of them." "I did my job," Claire said, though her voice wavered slightly, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain from her limbs. "No," he said, standing, crossing the room until he was close enough that she could see the exhaustion and gratitude tangled together in his eyes. "You did far more than your job. You walked into a house full of armed strangers in the middle of a storm, and you saved my family without asking a single question about who we are or why we needed you." "I did ask questions," Claire pointed out, a tired smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "You just did not answer most of them." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first she had seen since he broke into her kitchen. "Fair enough." Marta gently ushered them both back to allow Ivy to rest, and Claire finally allowed herself to breathe, leaning against the wall in the hallway as the weight of the night settled over her. Her hands were shaking now that there was nothing left to steady. Damien noticed, and without a word, he draped his own dry coat over her shoulders, the warmth startling against her rain-soaked skin. "I will have someone drive you home," he said, "whenever you are ready." "What happens now?" Claire asked. "To me, I mean. I know things I probably should not know." His expression darkened slightly, guarded again. The wall she had glimpsed cracks in now solidly back in place. "Nothing happens to you. You have my word. Whatever you saw tonight, Whatever you think you understand about who I am, it ends here. You go back to your life, and we go back to ours." Claire studied his face, searching for the lie in his words, but found none. Still, something about the finality of his statement left an odd, hollow feeling in her chest. One she did not have the energy to examine that night. "All right," she said simply. The scarred man, whom she now knew as Leo, drove her home through streets, slowly being cleared of storm debris, the worst of the rain finally beginning to ease. Claire sat quietly, watching the city lights blur past, her mind replaying every second of the last few hours. She thought of Ivy's exhausted, joyful face. She thought of Damien's hands, steady and sure even as fear lived behind his eyes. She thought of the strange, magnetic tension that had crackled between them in that hallway, unspoken and undeniable. When Leo pulled up outside her small house, the broken kitchen window still visible from the street, he turned to look at her. "Mr. Cross wanted me to tell you that repairs will be handled tomorrow morning, and that he is in your debt." "Tell him he does not owe me anything," Claire said, gathering her bag. "I would have gone regardless. That is who I am." Leo studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. That is exactly why he said what he said. Claire stepped out into the cool, rain-washed night, watching the car disappear down the street before she finally allowed herself to exhale. Her house was dark, her window shattered, glass scattered across her kitchen floor, and yet as she stood there in the aftermath of the strangest night of her life, she found herself thinking not of the danger, but of the man whose eyes had held both violence and vulnerability in equal measure. She told herself it meant nothing. He had said it himself. Tonight ended here. But as she swept the broken glass from her floor and watched the storm finally clear from the sky, some quiet, stubborn part of her did not quite believe it was truly over. Somewhere across the city, a newborn girl slept safely in her mother's arms because of what Claire had done tonight. And somewhere in that same house, a man who commanded fear from grown men had looked at her like she was something rare and unexpected. The storm had passed, but Claire had the distinct feeling that whatever had started that night was only just beginning. She did not sleep much after that. She sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea slowly going cold in her hands, staring at the boarded space where her window used to be, replaying the night over and over. She thought about the way Ivy had gripped her hand during the worst of the pain, trusting a complete stranger with her life and the life of her child. She thought about Marta's steady presence, a woman clearly used to handling crisis with quiet competence. Mostly, though, she thought about Damien Cross, the way his voice had cracked just slightly when he asked if Ivy would be all right, the way a man capable of such visible danger could also look so afraid of losing someone he loved. By morning, the sun had returned, bright and indifferent, as though the storm had never happened at all. Claire dressed for her regular clinic hours, forcing herself back into the rhythm of her ordinary life. She had 4 appointments that day, expectant mothers coming in for routine checkups, and she intended to treat the day like any other, no matter how strange the night before had been. She was only halfway through her morning coffee when a knock sounded at her door. 2 workmen stood on her porch, toolboxes in hand, already unloading a new pane of glass from their truck. "Miss Bennett, we are here about the window." Claire blinked, momentarily confused, before remembering Leo's words from the night before. "Repairs will be handled tomorrow morning." She had assumed it was simply something people like that said to smooth things over, not an actual promise kept with such precision. "Yes," she said slowly. "Come in." The men worked quickly and quietly, replacing the shattered glass within the hour, leaving no trace of the chaos from the previous night, except the faint, lingering smell of rain, still clinging to her kitchen curtains. When they left, one of them handed her a plain envelope. "Mr. Cross asked us to give you this," he said, before tipping his cap and walking back to the truck. Claire opened it once she was alone. Inside was a short note, written in sharp, confident handwriting. "Thank you again. If you ever need anything, you know where to find us. Damien." She read the note 3 times before folding it and setting it on her counter, telling herself she was simply being careful, keeping the information in case of some future emergency. She told herself that was the only reason her heart had done something strange and unfamiliar when she saw his name written in his own hand. Her clinic that day was busy, filled with familiar faces and familiar routines, women in various stages of pregnancy asking their usual questions about diet, movement, and delivery. Claire moved through her appointments with practiced ease, but her mind kept drifting back to the storm, to the fear in Damien's eyes, to the impossible strength in his hands when he had knelt beside Ivy's couch. Her last patient of the day was an elderly woman named Margaret, a regular at the clinic, who came in more for company than medical need, since her own daughter had long since grown and moved away. "You seem distracted today, dear," Margaret said, watching Claire check her blood pressure with slightly less focus than usual. "It has been a strange few days," Claire admitted. "Strange how?" Claire hesitated, unsure how much to say, unsure even how to explain the tangled feelings still sitting heavy in her chest. "I helped deliver a baby last night, under difficult circumstances." Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. "Difficult how?" "It does not matter," Claire said, forcing a smile. "Both mother and baby are healthy. That is what matters." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the kind of look only someone who had lived many decades could give, seeing more than most people intended to show. "You have that look," she said finally. "What look?" "The look my daughter had when she met her husband." "Something happened to you last night, beyond delivering a baby." Claire laughed, though it came out slightly unsteady. "It is nothing like that, Margaret. I do not even know the man's full story. I likely will never see him again." But even as she said the words, some quiet part of her did not fully believe them. That evening, after closing the clinic, Claire found herself standing at her kitchen counter, staring again at the note in Damien's handwriting, running her thumb over the sharp, confident letters of his name. She told herself she was only curious about how Ivy and the baby were recovering. She told herself that was the only reason she kept thinking about him. She was still standing there when headlights swept briefly across her window, a car slowing outside before continuing down the street. Her heart jumped, foolishly, before she reminded herself that it was likely just a neighbor returning home. Still, she found herself walking to the window, watching the empty street a moment longer than necessary, wondering, despite every warning instinct telling her not to, whether their paths would truly end where he claimed they would. Something told her they would not. The gunshot rang out before Claire even registered the sound of the car pulling up outside her clinic. She dropped to the floor instinctively, her heart slamming against her ribs, glass raining down from the front window above her head. For a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but her own ragged breathing and the sound of a car speeding away into the night. "Miss Bennett, are you hurt?" She looked up to see Leo standing in the doorway, gun drawn, scanning the street behind him, before stepping fully inside. Claire's hands were shaking as she pushed herself up from the floor, glass crunching beneath her palms. "What just happened?" she demanded, her voice higher than she intended. "Someone shot at my clinic." "A warning," Leo said grimly, holstering his weapon. "Someone wanted Mr. Cross to know they are watching who he visits." Claire's stomach dropped. She had not seen Damien in over 2 weeks, not since the note and the workman, and the strange, aching silence that followed. She had told herself the distance was for the best, that whatever brief connection had sparked between them that stormy night belonged to a world she had no business entering. Apparently, someone else had decided otherwise. "He has been coming here?" she asked. "I have not seen him." "He has been watching from a distance," Leo admitted, "making sure you were safe. He did not want you to know." Claire felt something twist in her chest, equal parts anger, and something far softer she refused to name. "That is not protection, Leo. That is a man putting a target on an innocent woman's back without even telling her." Before Leo could answer, another car screeched to a stop outside, and Damien was through the door within seconds, his eyes wild with a fear Claire had only seen once before, the night Ivy nearly died. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and gripped her shoulders, his gaze moving over her face, her arms, searching for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent. "I am fine," Claire said, though her voice still shook slightly. Frightened, but fine. Relief flooded his features before hardening back into something colder, angrier. He turned to Leo. "Get someone to fix this window tonight, and find out who did this. Now." Leo nodded and disappeared, leaving Claire alone with Damien amid the wreckage of broken glass and scattered supplies. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You have been watching me," Claire finally said. "For 2 weeks." Damien's jaw tightened. "I wanted to make sure you were safe after everything that happened. I did not intend for you to notice." "I did not notice," Claire said. "Leo told me, which means you were hiding it, which somehow makes it worse." "I was trying to protect you without complicating your life further," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Clearly, I failed at both." Claire crossed her arms, adrenaline slowly giving way to exhaustion. "Why does someone want to send you a warning through me? I delivered a baby, Damien. That is all I did." His expression darkened, guilt and anger warring behind his eyes. "There is a family, the Marinos, who have wanted my territory for years. They know that hurting the people I care about is more effective than coming after me directly. Somehow, they learned about that night, about you." The words landed heavier than she expected. "The people I care about." She told herself not to read too much into it, that he likely meant it in the way anyone might care about someone who saved a family member's life. But something in the way he said it, low and almost reluctant, suggested otherwise. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do I need protection? Should I be afraid every time I walk to my own car?" "No," Damien said firmly. "I will make sure nothing like this happens again. I will pull back, stop visiting, stop watching. It was reckless of me to come near you at all after that night. I let my gratitude turn into something careless, and you paid the price for it." Something in his tone, resigned and final, sent an unexpected wave of disappointment through her. "Is that what you think this is? Gratitude?" Damien's eyes met hers, something raw flickering there before he masked it again. What else would it be? Claire did not have an answer, not one she was ready to say out loud, so instead she busied herself sweeping glass from her floor, needing something to do with her shaking hands. Damien watched her for a long moment, before crouching down to help, gathering the larger shards without being asked. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied simply, continuing anyway. They worked in silence for several minutes, the tension between them shifting into something quieter, less charged with fear, and more with the strange, careful awareness of two people standing closer than either intended. When the floor was finally clear, Damien straightened, dusting off his hands. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I will stay away. It is safer for you." "And if I do not want you to stay away?" The words left her mouth before she fully decided to say them, surprising them both. Damien went very still. "Claire, I am not asking you to put me in danger," she said quickly, her cheeks warming. "I am asking why a man who claims to want distance has spent 2 weeks quietly making sure I was safe. That does not sound like distance to me." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, some internal battle playing out behind his eyes. "Because I could not stop thinking about you," he admitted finally, the words seeming to cost him something. "About the way you walked into my house that night, terrified but steady, saving 2 lives without hesitation. I have spent my entire life around people who want something from me. You did not want anything, you simply helped, because that is who you are." Claire's breath caught. "Damien, it does not change anything," he continued, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "My world is dangerous. I have enemies who would use you against me without a second thought, exactly as they tried tonight. The right thing to do is walk away and let you live the quiet life you deserve." "Maybe I get to decide what I deserve," Claire said quietly. "Not you." He looked at her then, something shifting behind his eyes, and for a moment, the space between them felt impossibly small. Neither of them moved closer, but neither pulled away either, the air thick with everything unsaid. "I should go," Damien finally said, though he made no move toward the door. "Before I do something, we will both regret." "Would you regret it?" Claire asked softly. His eyes darkened. "No," he admitted. "That is exactly the problem." He left shortly after, promising to send someone to reinforce her clinic's security, and Claire stood alone in the newly swept room long after his car disappeared down the street, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Over the following days, despite his warnings, Damien did not fully disappear. He sent no more notes, made no more declarations, but small signs of his presence lingered at the edges of her life. A car parked quietly down the street some evenings. New locks installed on her clinic doors without explanation. Once, she found a simple bouquet of wildflowers left on her porch, with no note at all, though she recognized Leo's car pulling away just as she stepped outside. She told herself she should discourage it, should insist he truly stay away for both their sakes. Instead, she found herself watching for that car each evening, disappointed on the nights it did not appear. 2 weeks after the shooting, she encountered him again, not through danger this time, but coincidence, or something that felt too deliberate to truly be chance. She was leaving the small market near her clinic when she nearly collided with him coming from the opposite direction, both of them freezing in surprise. Damien. His name still felt strange and warm on her tongue. Claire. He looked almost sheepish, an expression that seemed foreign on a man usually so composed. I was not following you. I promise. I had business nearby. I believe you, she said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite herself, though I am beginning to think this city is smaller than I realized. It is not that small, he admitted, a rare hint of humor crossing his features. I may have taken this route hoping I would see you. Claire laughed, the sound surprising her with how easily it came. That is quite the confession for a man who insisted 2 weeks ago that distance was safest. I never claimed to be good at following my own advice, Damien said, and for a moment, standing there on an ordinary street corner with groceries in her arms, the danger and darkness of his world felt very far away, replaced instead by something that felt dangerously close to hope. They stood there longer than necessary, trading small, careful conversation, both of them clearly aware that whatever was building between them defied every warning either had given the other. When they finally parted ways, Damien's hand brushed hers briefly, lingering just a moment too long to be accidental, and Claire walked home that evening with her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with him. She still did not know exactly what world he belonged to, what violence lived behind his careful control, but she was beginning to understand that despite every reason to walk away, some part of her no longer wanted to. A few days later, Ivy showed up at her clinic unannounced. The baby, now nearly a month old, wrapped snugly in a blanket against her chest. Claire's face lit up the moment she saw them both, ushering Ivy into her small office and immediately fussing over the baby's healthy weight and steady breathing. She is beautiful, Ivy. Truly. What did you name her? Grace, Ivy said, smiling down at her daughter. It felt right, given everything that happened that night. Claire's chest warmed at the name, though she quickly busied herself checking Ivy's own recovery, taking her blood pressure, asking careful questions about her healing and her rest. Ivy answered easily, clearly comfortable in Claire's presence, before her expression shifted into something more curious. He talks about you, you know, Ivy said, watching Claire's reaction carefully. Claire kept her eyes on her notes, though her pulse quickened. Who does? Damien, Ivy said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. He does not say much. He never does. But I know my brother-in-law well enough to notice when something has changed in him. He has been different since that night, quieter in some ways, softer in others. I am sure that has nothing to do with me, Claire said, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. He mentioned the shooting outside your clinic, Ivy continued, ignoring Claire's deflection. He blames himself entirely. I have never seen him so shaken, not even when things get dangerous in his usual line of work. That tells me something, Claire. Claire set down her clipboard, finally meeting Ivy's steady gaze. Your family's world is dangerous, Ivy. I saw that firsthand. I do not know if it is wise for me to get any closer to it, no matter what I might feel. Ivy's expression softened with understanding, rather than judgment. I will not pretend our life is simple or safe. It is not. I have spent years learning to live with that reality, and it has not always been easy. But I will tell you this. The night you walked into that house, terrified and soaked and furious, and still chose to save my life and my daughter's without hesitation, I saw something in you that our world does not get to see very often. Kindness that is not weakness. Strength that does not need violence to prove itself. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at the words. "Thank you for saying that." "I am not simply saying it to be kind," Ivy said. "I am saying it because I think my brother-in-law needs exactly that kind of strength in his life, whether he admits it to himself or not. He has spent so many years protecting everyone around him that he forgot what it feels like to have someone simply care about him in return, without wanting anything from his position or his power." The conversation stayed with Claire long after Ivy left, little Grace cooing softly as they walked out into the afternoon sun. She found herself replaying Ivy's words throughout the rest of her appointments that day, unable to fully shake the warmth they had stirred in her chest. That evening, as she was closing the clinic, a familiar car pulled up outside, and her heart gave an involuntary leap before she even saw who stepped out. Damien walked in, looking slightly less composed than usual, his tie loosened, his expression carrying the particular weariness of a long and difficult day. "I heard Ivy came to visit," he said, leaning against her doorframe. "She did. Grace is doing wonderfully." "That is not the only thing I heard," he admitted, a faint, almost embarrassed smile tugging at his mouth. "Apparently she felt it necessary to discuss my personal feelings with you." Claire's cheeks warmed. She may have mentioned something along those lines. "I am going to have a conversation with her about boundaries," Damien said, though there was no real irritation in his voice, only a kind of resigned fondness. She was not wrong, though, was she? Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her across the small room, the last light of evening slanting gold through the windows behind her. "No," he admitted finally, "she was not wrong." Claire's heart pounded as she stepped closer, closing some of the distance that had lingered between them since that first stormy night. "Then stop pretending distance is the only option, Damien. I am not asking you to change who you are. I am asking you to stop deciding for both of us what I can and cannot handle." His eyes searched hers, something fierce and uncertain warring behind them. "If something happened to you because of me, I do not know if I could live with that. And if nothing happens between us at all because you were too afraid to try," Claire countered gently, "will you be able to live with that instead?" For a long moment, he said nothing, the weight of her question settling heavily in the quiet room. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the remaining distance between them, his hand rising to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch far softer than she expected from a man who commanded so much fear in his world. "You make it very difficult to keep my promises to myself," he murmured. "Good," Claire whispered, her breath catching. "Some promises deserve to be broken." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the air between them charged with everything unsaid, every warning ignored, every careful wall beginning, finally, to come down. Outside, the evening settled quietly over the city, unaware that somewhere within it, two people from entirely different worlds had just decided, without another word needing to be spoken, to stop fighting whatever was growing between them. Later that night, after Damien had gone, Claire sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the street below settle into darkness. She thought about Ivy's words, about the strange, unexpected path that had brought a Mafia boss into her quiet, ordinary life. She thought about the fear still lodged somewhere in her chest, the knowledge that danger had already found her once, and could easily find her again. And yet, beneath the fear, something steadier had taken root. She thought of the way Damien's hand had felt against her face, gentle, in a way that seemed to surprise even him. She thought of the raw honesty in his voice when he admitted he could not stop thinking about her. Whatever waited ahead, whatever danger his world might still bring to her door, she found she was no longer willing to let fear alone make her choices. Across the city, in a house far grander than her own, Damien stood at his window with a drink he had not touched, his mind equally occupied. He had spent years building walls meant to keep everyone at a careful distance, convinced that closeness only created weakness his enemies could exploit. Yet one stormy night had cracked something open in him that he no longer knew how to close again, and standing there in the quiet dark, he found he did not entirely want to. Leo found him there an hour later, a folder of new information in his hands, his expression grim. "We have confirmation," he said. "It was the Marinos who ordered the shooting at her clinic. They know about her. They know what she means to you." Damien's jaw tightened, the fragile peace of the evening, giving way once more to old instincts, old dangers. Then we make sure they understand exactly what will happen if they come near her again. Leo nodded, already turning to leave, before pausing at the door. For what it is worth, he said, I have not seen you like this in a long time. Whatever it costs to protect it, I do not think you will regret trying. Damien did not answer, but as he turned back to the window, watching the distant lights of the city glimmering against the night sky, he allowed himself, just for a moment, to hope that this time, protecting something good would not mean losing it entirely. The alarm on Claire's phone screamed at 3 a.m, jolting her upright in bed, her heart already racing before she fully understood why. It took her a moment to realize the sound was not her alarm at all, but the security system Damien's men had installed weeks earlier, blaring through her small house with an urgency that stole the breath from her lungs. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept beside her bed, more out of instinct than any real belief it would help, and crept toward her bedroom door. Downstairs, she heard glass breaking, heavy footsteps moving through her kitchen, someone searching for something, or someone, with clear and dangerous intent. Her hands shook as she dialed the number Damien had given her weeks ago, the one he told her to call only in true emergencies. It rang once before he answered, his voice sharp and immediately alert. Claire, what is wrong? Someone is in my house, she whispered, pressing herself against the wall beside her door, listening to the footsteps growing closer. Downstairs, I hear them moving. Stay where you are. Lock your door if you can. I am 5 minutes away, and I am already calling Leo. The line went dead, and Claire fumbled to lock her bedroom door with trembling fingers, backing away just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, as a shadow moved beneath the crack of her door, testing the handle once, twice, before something heavy slammed against the wood. She screamed despite herself, stumbling backward, gripping the bat with both hands as the door splintered on the third hit. A man she had never seen before stood in the doorway, his face partially covered, his eyes cold and calculating as they found her in the dim light. You should not be involved in this, he said, his voice flat, almost bored, as though what he was about to do meant nothing to him at all. But Mr. Cross needs to learn that nothing he cares about is safe. Claire swung the bat with every ounce of strength fear could provide, catching him across the arm as he lunged toward her. He grunted in pain but did not stop, grabbing her wrist hard enough to bruise, twisting the bat from her grip with practiced ease. She fought against him, kicking, clawing, refusing to go quietly, her mind screaming that this could not be how her story ended, not like this, not in her own bedroom in the dead of night. The sound of the front door being kicked open echoed up the stairs, followed immediately by shouting, footsteps thundering through her house, with a speed and violence entirely different from the intruder's calculated movements. Damien appeared in her doorway seconds later, and Claire had never in her life seen an expression so purely, terrifyingly furious. What happened next, passed in a blur she would never fully piece back together afterward. Damien moved with a speed and precision that revealed exactly how dangerous a man he truly was beneath his careful control, and within moments, the intruder was on the ground, subdued, groaning in pain, while Damien knelt over him with an intensity that made even Claire, still shaking against her wall, take an instinctive step back. Damien, she said softly, her voice breaking through whatever dark place his mind had gone. He is down. I am safe now. Something in his expression shifted at the sound of her voice, the violence in his eyes giving way, slowly, to something closer to devastation, as he turned to look at her properly, taking in her disheveled hair, the bruise already forming on her wrist, the fear still etched into every line of her face. You are hurt, he said, his voice raw, crossing the room in 2 strides to gently take her injured wrist in his hands, examining it with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence still simmering beneath his skin. I am all right, Claire whispered, though tears finally began falling now that the immediate danger had passed. You came, you actually came. Of course I came, Damien said fiercely, pulling her carefully into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head as she pressed her face against his chest, finally allowing herself to fall apart, now that she no longer had to be strong alone. I will always come, Claire. Always. Leo arrived minutes later with two other men, handling the intruder with grim efficiency, while Damien refused to leave Claire's side, sitting with her on the edge of her bed, as paramedics from within his own network checked her wrist and confirmed no serious damage had been done beyond bruising and shock. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning," Damien said quietly, once they were finally alone again, the house slowly being cleared and secured around them. "Instead of pretending distance would protect you." "Tell me now," Claire said, her voice steady despite everything. "All of it. I do not want careful half-truths anymore, Damien. Not after tonight." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands, as though searching for the right place to begin. "My family has controlled territory in this city for 3 generations, he finally said. "My father built an empire through fear and violence, and when he died, that empire became mine to protect, whether I wanted it or not. I did not choose this life, Claire, but I have spent every day since inheriting it, making choices that keep my family, and the people who depend on us, safe. And the Marinos? A rival family who has wanted our territory for years," he continued. "They see any weakness as opportunity, and lately, they have decided that you represent a weakness worth exploiting. That man downstairs was sent to hurt you, to send a message that nothing and no one connected to me is truly safe." Claire absorbed his words slowly, the full weight of the danger she had unknowingly stepped into finally settling over her. "Why me? I delivered a baby. That is all I did that first night." "Because I could not stay away from you afterward," Damien admitted, guilt heavy in his voice. "And apparently, my enemies noticed long before I was willing to admit it to myself." "So this is your fault," Claire said, though there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet, careful honesty. "Not because you did anything wrong tonight, but because you care about me, and that alone was enough to put a target on my back." Damien's jaw tightened. "Yes, which is exactly why I should walk away right now, before this goes any further, before something worse than a bruised wrist happens to you." "No," Claire said firmly, surprising them both with the strength in her voice. "I told you once already, Damien. I get to decide what risks I am willing to take. You do not get to make that choice for me simply because you feel guilty. Claire, tonight someone broke into your home wanting to hurt you because of me. That is not something I can simply accept and move past. And I did not simply accept watching you nearly die at Ivy's bedside without doing something either," Claire countered. "I did not know you, and I still fought for both her life and yours that night, because that is who I am. I do not walk away from people I care about simply because the situation is dangerous." Something in her words seemed to finally reach him, the fierce guilt in his eyes softening into something more vulnerable, more honest. "You care about me," he said quietly, as though testing the truth of the words for the first time. "I have cared about you since that first storm," Claire admitted, her own voice softening now. "I have simply been too afraid to say it plainly, in case saying it out loud made all of this feel even more impossible than it already does." Damien reached for her uninjured hand, holding it gently between both of his own. "I do not deserve someone as good as you, in a life as dangerous as mine." "Let me decide that," Claire said softly. "I am not asking you to change who you are, Damien. I am asking you to trust me with the truth, instead of deciding on your own what I can and cannot handle. Tonight proved I am stronger than you seem to think." He studied her for a long moment, something settling in his expression, a decision finally being made. "If you truly want to stay in this, truly want to face what that means, I need you to understand it will not simply end with tonight. The Marinos will not stop easily. There will be more danger before there is peace." "Then we face it together," Claire said simply. "Not apart, not with you making decisions in the shadows while I sit helplessly waiting to be protected." Slowly, deliberately, Damien nodded, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders as he pulled her gently back into his arms, resting his chin against the top of her head. "Together then," he murmured, "though I reserve the right to worry about you constantly." Claire laughed softly against his chest, the sound feeling strange and precious after the terror of the night. "I would expect nothing less." Outside, the first hints of dawn began creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and rose, the storm of violence finally settling into something calmer, steadier. Claire's house bore the marks of the night's chaos. Broken doors and shattered glass scattered through rooms that had once felt entirely safe. But as she sat, wrapped in Damien's arms, watching the sunrise slowly claim the sky, she found she was no longer afraid of what came next. Whatever danger still waited ahead, whatever battles remained to be fought, she had made her choice. And for the first time since that stormy night months ago, she felt certain it was the right one. By mid-morning, Leo had arranged for Claire to stay temporarily at a secured property while her house was properly repaired and fortified against future threats. She resisted at first, unwilling to abandon her clinic and the patients who depended on her, but Damien's quiet, steady insistence, paired with the very real danger still surrounding them, eventually convinced her that caution, at least for now, was simply wisdom rather than surrender. As she packed a small bag of essentials, Damien stood in her doorway, watching her with an expression she was slowly learning to read, equal parts protectiveness and something far softer underneath. "This is not forever," he promised. "Just until we are certain you are safe." "I know," Claire said, offering him a small, tired smile. "I trust you, Damien. That is not something I say lightly, given everything I now know about your world." His expression softened further, something almost reverent passing behind his eyes. "I will not take that trust lightly either." As they left her house together that morning, the wreckage of the previous night still visible behind them, Claire felt the quiet, certain knowledge settle over her that whatever storms still waited ahead, she would face them with him beside her, no longer as a stranger pulled unwillingly into his world, but as someone who had chosen, fully and knowingly, to stay. The secured property turned out to be a quiet house on the edge of the city, tucked behind tall gates and even taller trees, far removed from the noise and danger of the streets she was used to. 2 guards stood watch at the entrance, nodding respectfully as Damien led her inside, and Claire could not help but marvel at how easily this world of careful protection and quiet danger had folded itself around her life in such a short time. "You will be safe here," Damien said, setting her bag down in a bright, comfortable bedroom overlooking a small garden. "Marta will be nearby if you need anything, and I will check in as often as I can." "As often as you can," Claire repeated, a small teasing note creeping into her voice despite the exhaustion still lingering in her bones, meaning, "You will actually be here constantly, whether your enemies approve or not." A faint smile tugged at his mouth, the first real one she had seen since the chaos of the previous night. Something like that. Over the following days, Claire settled into an unfamiliar rhythm, one built around careful routines and quiet company, rather than the busy, independent life she had known before. Marta proved a steady, comforting presence, sharing stories over tea about the family's history, about Damien's late father, about the responsibilities he had carried since he was barely more than a boy himself. "He never wanted this life," Marta told her one afternoon, watching Claire carefully as she spoke. "His father groomed him for it from the time he could walk, but Damien always had a softer heart than his father ever did. He simply learned to hide it well, out of necessity." "He does not hide it as well as he thinks," Claire admitted, smiling faintly as she thought of the tenderness in his hands the night he found her injured, the raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of caring for her. Marta's eyes crinkled with quiet approval. "No, dear. I do not believe he does. Not anymore, at least. Not since you." Damien visited each evening, arriving later some nights than others depending on whatever business demanded his attention, but always arriving nonetheless, always seeking her out first before attending to anything else. Their conversations grew easier with each visit, the careful walls between them slowly continuing to fall as they traded stories of their very different lives, finding unexpected common ground in shared losses, shared responsibilities, shared stubbornness, neither of them fully understood how to set aside. One evening, nearly a week into her stay, Damien arrived visibly exhausted, his shoulders carrying a tension Claire had not seen since the night of the break-in. She found him in the study, staring at a folder of documents he had not touched in several minutes, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Bad news?" she asked softly, settling into the chair across from him. "The Merinos are growing bolder," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "What happened at your house was meant to be a warning, but I believe they are preparing for something larger. I do not yet know what." Claire's stomach tightened with familiar fear, though she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "What can I do to help?" Damien looked up at her, something almost startled crossing his features. "You do not need to do anything, Claire. This is not your battle to fight." "It became my battle the moment someone broke into my home," she said firmly. "I am not asking to be involved in violence, Damien. I am asking to be trusted with information, the way a partner should be trusted, instead of shielded from every difficult truth, simply because you are afraid of frightening me." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a slow, reluctant respect, replacing his earlier hesitation. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known," he said quietly. "Most people in my life either fear me or want something from me. You do neither." "I care about you," Claire said simply. "That is different from both of those things." Slowly, he reached across the small space between their chairs, taking her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "I care about you too," he admitted, the words clearly still unfamiliar on his tongue, spoken carefully, deliberately, as though testing their weight. "More than I know how to properly put into words." Claire's heart swelled at the admission, simple as it was, and she found herself leaning forward, closing the remaining distance between them, until her forehead rested gently against his. "Then let that be enough for tonight," she whispered. "Whatever waits for us tomorrow, let tonight simply be about this." For a long, quiet moment, they sat together in the dim light of the study, the weight of the danger surrounding them, temporarily set aside in favor of something softer, something neither of them had expected to find amid so much darkness. Outside, the guards continued their watch, the world beyond the gates, carrying on with its usual dangers. But within those walls, for just a little while, peace found room enough to exist. Later, as Damien walked her back to her room, he paused at the door, his hand lingering on the frame. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow I will tell you everything I know about what the Marinos are planning. No more careful half-truths. You deserve better than that from me." Claire smiled up at him, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the uncertainty still waiting beyond tonight. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for making me want to be someone worth trusting," he replied, before pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead and disappearing down the hallway, leaving her standing there long after his footsteps had faded, her heart fuller than it had been in a very long time. The scream tore from Claire's throat before a rough hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the sound as two men dragged her away from the garden gate she had only stepped outside to close. Her feet kicked against the gravel path, her fingers clawing at the arm locked around her waist, but the men were far stronger, far more prepared than she could match alone. "Quiet now," one of them growled against her ear, his accent thick and unfamiliar. "Mr. Marino simply wants a conversation with you." Panic exploded through her chest as they forced her into the back of a waiting car. A dark bag pulled roughly over her head before she could catch even a glimpse of the street around her. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against pavement, and Claire fought to keep her breathing steady despite the terror clawing through every part of her body. She thought of Damien, of the promise he had made just the night before to keep her safe, to tell her everything. And now, within hours, everything had shattered into exactly the danger he had feared all along. The drive felt endless, though she knew later it had only been perhaps 20 minutes, before the car finally stopped and rough hands pulled her out, guiding her stumbling steps into what she could only assume was some kind of building. The bag was finally removed once she was pushed into a chair, her wrists bound tightly behind her, and she blinked against the sudden light, taking in her surroundings with rising dread. A man stood before her, older than Damien, with cold, calculating eyes and an air of quiet menace that made her skin crawl. Two other men flanked him, weapons visible at their sides, watching her with the same detached indifference as the man who had broken into her home weeks earlier. "Miss Bennett," the man said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more frightening. "My name is Victor Marino. I apologize for the roughness of your arrival, but I needed to ensure Damien understood the seriousness of this conversation." "What do you want from me?" Claire demanded, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Nothing from you specifically," Victor said, circling her chair slowly, unhurried, clearly enjoying the display of power. You are simply the most effective way to finally bring Damien Cross to the table on my terms. He has ignored every reasonable offer I have made for his territory. Perhaps he will reconsider when the cost involves someone he has grown so fond of. Claire's mind raced, searching for anything useful in his words, anything she might use to her advantage. He will not give you what you want simply because you have me. You clearly do not know him as well as you think. Something flickered across Victor's expression. Brief irritation quickly smoothed away. We shall see. In my experience, even the most stubborn men become reasonable when something they truly value is at stake. He left her then, guarded by the two silent men, and Claire spent the following hours fighting against both her restraints and her own mounting fear, forcing herself to think clearly, despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. She thought of Damien's face, the fierce protectiveness in his eyes the night of the break-in, and she held on to the certainty that he would come for her, whatever it cost him. Miles away, in a house that had grown eerily silent since Leo burst through the door with the news, Damien stood frozen for only a single moment before something cold and lethal settled over his features, the careful control he usually maintained, collapsing entirely into pure, focused fury. "Where," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "did they take her?" "We do not know yet," Leo admitted, his own expression grim. "But we are working on it. Victor left a message. He wants to negotiate your territory for her safe return." Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to tear the city apart until he found her. "He will not get either," he said. "Gather everyone. We find her tonight, and then Victor Marino learns exactly what happens when someone threatens what is mine." The following hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos, Damien's men moving through the city with ruthless efficiency, calling in favors, tracking whispers, following every possible lead toward the Marino family's holdings. Damien himself moved among them with a focused intensity that left even his most hardened men slightly unsettled, his usual careful calculation replaced by something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose, driven entirely by the need to bring the woman he loved home safely. He called in every debt owed to him, every favor collected over years of careful, patient dealings, pressing informants across the city for even the smallest scrap of information. A man who ran a small shop near the docks mentioned trucks moving late at night toward an old warehouse district near the river. A woman who cleaned offices for one of Victor's known associates recalled overhearing mention of a holding property, rarely used, kept quiet precisely for situations requiring discretion. Piece by piece, the picture came together, and Damien felt something settle in his chest that was not quite relief, not yet, but the first solid foothold of hope since Leo had delivered the news that shattered his evening. He gathered his men near the warehouse district as the sun began sinking low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement and rusted fences. "We move quietly first," he instructed, his voice low and controlled, despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. "I want eyes on every entrance before we make a single move. She is inside there somewhere, and I will not risk her safety with recklessness." Leo nodded, already dispatching men to scout the perimeter, while Damien forced himself to wait, every instinct screaming at him to charge forward immediately. The minutes stretched unbearably as his men reported back, confirming guard positions, entry points, the layout of the building as best they could determine from careful observation. When word finally came that Claire had been sighted through a barred window on the building's east side, Damien felt something inside him snap into focused, deadly resolve. "Now," he said simply, and the careful quiet of the operation exploded instantly into decisive, coordinated action. His men moved with practiced precision, clearing the perimeter guards swiftly and efficiently, the element of surprise working entirely in their favor. Damien led the charge toward the building's entrance himself, refusing to remain behind while others risked their lives to reach the woman he loved, his weapon steady in his hands despite the storm of emotion raging beneath his controlled exterior. Gunfire erupted as Victor's remaining guards realized too late that they were under attack. But Damien's men, better trained and driven by a purpose far more personal than any payment could inspire, moved through the resistance with brutal efficiency. Damien himself pushed forward relentlessly, his mind fixed entirely on reaching the room where Claire was being held, ignoring everything else around him except the singular need to see her safe with his own eyes. Back in the dim room where she remained bound, Claire had lost track of time, her wrists raw from struggling against the ropes, her voice hoarse from calling out to guards who ignored her entirely. She refused to let herself cry, refused to give Victor Marino the satisfaction of seeing her break, but the fear gnawed steadily at her resolve, as the hours stretched on with no sign of rescue. Alone in that dim room, Claire tried every trick she could think of to loosen the ropes binding her wrists, twisting and pulling until her skin burned raw, but the knots held firm no matter how she struggled. She studied her surroundings carefully instead, memorizing details she hoped might matter later. The small barred window near the ceiling, the single door with its heavy lock, the faint sound of water somewhere beyond the walls suggesting they were close to the river that ran through the eastern edge of the city. She thought of her clinic, of the mothers and babies who depended on her steady hands, of Ivy and little Grace, of Marta's warm, familiar presence at the secured house. Mostly, though, her thoughts kept circling back to Damien, to the fierce promise in his eyes, the night he found her injured after the break-in. He had told her he would always come for her, and despite the fear twisting through her chest, some steady, stubborn part of her believed him completely. One of the guards, younger than the others, occasionally glanced at her with something that almost resembled discomfort, shifting his weight, avoiding her eyes when she tried to speak to him. Claire seized on the small opening, keeping her voice soft, non-threatening. "You do not seem entirely comfortable with this," she said quietly, holding someone against their will. "Quiet," he muttered, though without much conviction behind the word. "I am a midwife," Claire continued, undeterred. "I help bring babies into the world. I have never hurt anyone in my life. Does that not bother you, even a little?" The young guard's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the door, as though checking whether anyone else could hear the conversation. "This is not personal," he said finally. "It is business. Mr. Marino wants territory. You are simply a means to an end." "That does not make it right," Claire said gently. "Whatever cause you believe you are serving, hurting an innocent person is never truly business. It is simply cruelty wearing a more comfortable name." The guard said nothing further, but Claire noticed the way his shoulders remained tense long after their exchange ended, and she allowed herself a small flicker of hope that perhaps not every person in this dangerous world was entirely beyond reaching. The door finally opened again, and Victor entered once more, his earlier pleasant demeanor gone, replaced by something colder, more impatient. "Your Damien Cross is proving more difficult to negotiate with than I anticipated," he said. "Perhaps he needs further motivation to take this seriously." Claire's heart pounded, as one of the guards stepped closer, but before he could reach her, the sound of gunfire erupted somewhere outside the building, followed by shouting, chaos breaking out beyond the walls of her small room. Victor's expression shifted instantly from irritation to alarm, barking orders at his remaining men as the sound of fighting grew closer. The door burst open moments later, and Damien stood in the frame, weapon raised, his eyes scanning the room until they found her, relief and fury warring across his features in equal measure. "Claire." "Damien," she gasped, tears finally breaking free now that rescue had truly arrived. He crossed the room in seconds, cutting through her restraints with quick, careful movements, his hands gentle despite the violence still radiating from every line of his body. "I have you," he said fiercely. "I have you now. You are safe." Victor Marino attempted to flee through a side door, but Leo caught him before he made it 3 steps, forcing him to his knees with the same ruthless efficiency the entire operation had been carried out with. Damien helped Claire to her feet, keeping one arm firmly around her as he turned to face the man who had dared to threaten everything he cared about. "You made a serious mistake tonight, Victor," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous. "You touched something that was never yours to touch." Victor, still on his knees, managed a defiant sneer despite his position. "This is not over, Cross. You know that. There will always be someone else willing to challenge you." "Perhaps," Damien said, "but it will not be you. Not anymore." Claire watched, still trembling from the night's terror, as Damien's men led Victor away, the balance of power in the city shifting decisively in that single, tense moment. She did not ask what would happen to him, did not want to know the details of a world she had only ever glimpsed the edges of, but she understood, watching the grim satisfaction on the faces of Damien's men, that whatever threat Victor Marino had posed was effectively ended. Damien turned back to her immediately, his expression softening from cold fury into something achingly tender as he gently examined the marks on her wrists, the exhaustion clear in her face. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I promised you safety, and instead you were taken because of me." "You came for me," Claire said softly, reaching up to touch his face, still hardly able to believe the danger had truly ended. "You tore through this entire city to find me." "I would tear through 100 cities," Damien said fiercely, pulling her carefully into his arms. "I told you once already, Claire. I will always come for you." They stood together amid the chaos slowly being cleared around them, and Claire allowed herself finally to fully break down, sobbing quietly against his chest, as the adrenaline of the night finally gave way to overwhelming relief. Damien held her steadily, murmuring soft, reassuring words against her hair, his own hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, and the true weight of how close he had come to losing her finally settled over him. The drive back to the secured house passed mostly in silence, Claire curled against his side, his arm wrapped protectively around her the entire way. Marta met them at the door, her relief evident as she immediately fussed over Claire's injuries, insisting on proper care for her wrists, despite Claire's exhausted protests that she was fine. Later that night, once her wounds had been cleaned and bandaged, and the worst of the day's chaos had finally settled, Claire found Damien standing alone in the study, staring out at the darkened garden beyond the window, his shoulders still carrying visible tension despite the danger having passed. "You should be resting," he said quietly, without turning around. "So should you," Claire replied, moving to stand beside him, slipping her bandaged hand carefully into his. He turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had never quite seen before, not even in their most tender moments. "I have spent my entire life believing that caring deeply about someone only creates weakness, a vulnerability my enemies can exploit," he admitted. "Tonight proved exactly that fear correct. Because of my feelings for you, you were taken, hurt, terrified. And because of your feelings for me," Claire said gently, "you tore through danger without hesitation to bring me home safely. That is not weakness, Damien. That is the truest kind of strength there is." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting deeply behind his eyes, years of careful walls finally crumbling entirely away. "I love you," he said, the words clearly costing him something significant to finally speak aloud, raw and unpracticed on his tongue. "I have known it for weeks now, perhaps longer, but tonight, watching Victor threaten to take you from me, I understood exactly how much I truly stand to lose." Claire's breath caught, tears rising once more, though this time from an entirely different kind of overwhelming emotion. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you since that first stormy night, though I was far too afraid to admit it until now." Slowly, gently, he drew her into his arms, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that held every ounce of fear, relief, and love that had built steadily between them since the night she first walked uninvited into his dangerous world. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, Claire felt something settle deeply within her chest, a certainty she had not fully expected to find amid so much danger. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her cheek. "Now," he said finally, "I have some very serious decisions to make about the kind of life I want to build, and whether it still has room for the empire my father left behind." Claire studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation in his expression, but found only quiet, steady resolve. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "know that I am not asking you to change for me. I fell for the man who tore through danger tonight without hesitation, the same man who has protected everyone he loves for years, even at great cost to himself. I only want you safe and happy in whatever life you choose to build." "I know," Damien said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "That is precisely why I am considering it at all. For the first time in my life, I finally have something worth building a different future for. They stood together a while longer in the quiet study, the events of the day slowly settling into memory, rather than immediate danger, and Claire found herself, despite everything, feeling strangely hopeful about whatever uncertain future still lay ahead. Whatever choices Damien faced in the coming days, she understood now, with complete certainty, that she intended to face them beside him, no matter the cost. 3 months had passed since the night in the warehouse, and Claire still woke sometimes with her heart racing, half expecting to find herself bound to a chair in a dim, unfamiliar room. But each time, the reality that greeted her instead was infinitely gentler, sunlight filtering through familiar curtains, Damien's steady breathing beside her, the quiet peace of a life she was only beginning to fully believe she was allowed to keep. She sat up carefully that morning, careful not to wake him, and made her way to the kitchen of the house they now shared, one Damien had purchased shortly after the danger from the Marino family had finally, truly, ended. It was smaller than the grand house he had grown up in, quieter, tucked into a neighborhood far removed from the world of territory and power he had spent his entire adult life navigating. The transition had not been simple. Claire remembered the long nights they spent discussing what a different future might look like, Damien wrestling with decades of inherited responsibility, the weight of a family legacy he had never fully chosen for himself. He had spent weeks in careful, difficult negotiations, transferring control of his territory to Leo, a man he trusted more than anyone else in his organization, someone steady enough to lead without losing himself entirely to the darker demands of that world. "Are you certain about this?" Claire had asked him more than once during those difficult weeks, watching the toll such enormous decisions took on him. "I never asked you to give up everything for me." "You did not need to ask," Damien told her each time, his conviction never wavering despite the difficulty of the choice. "I am not doing this only for you, Claire. I am doing it for myself, for the future I actually want, instead of the one that was simply handed to me." The process had not been without danger. Some within his organization resisted the change, unwilling to accept new leadership, and there had been tense weeks where Claire once again found herself watching the door a little too carefully, waiting for danger that thankfully, this time, never fully arrived. Leo proved a capable and respected leader, earning loyalty through fairness rather than fear, and slowly, steadily, the organization settled into its new structure, without the violence Claire had feared might follow. Damien himself stepped back almost entirely, retaining only enough involvement to ensure the transition remained smooth and his people remained protected, while building instead a quieter life centered around the woman who had walked uninvited into his world on a stormy night and refused ever since to leave it, or him, behind. Claire remembered vividly the evening Damien gathered his most trusted men to announce the change formally, her stomach twisted with nerves as she waited at home, uncertain how the news would be received. He returned late that night, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, but also something else, a kind of quiet relief she had not seen in him before. "How did it go?" she had asked, searching his expression carefully. "Better than I expected," he admitted, sinking onto the couch beside her. "There was resistance, as I anticipated, but Leo handled it well. A few men chose to leave, rather than accept new leadership. I let them go without incident. The rest understood, I think, that this was not weakness on my part, but a choice made from strength." "And how do you feel about it?" Claire asked gently, taking his hand. Damien considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Lighter," he finally said, seeming almost surprised by the word himself. "I did not realize how heavy that responsibility had become until I began setting it down." The weeks that followed brought their own quiet challenges, adjusting to a life with far more ordinary rhythms than either of them had previously known. Damien, so long accustomed to constant vigilance and calculated decisions, found himself somewhat at a loss during the early days of his new, quieter existence, restless in ways that surprised them both. "I do not quite know what to do with myself," he confessed one afternoon, watching Claire prepare for her clinic hours with far more purpose than he currently possessed in his own day. "Give it time," Claire told him, pressing a reassuring kiss to his cheek. "You spent your entire life needing to be constantly alert, constantly protecting everyone around you. Learning to simply exist without that pressure will not happen overnight. Slowly, he found his footing. He began assisting Ivy with managing the modest, legitimate businesses the family had built over the years, restaurants and property investments that required none of the danger his father's darker dealings once demanded. He discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, a genuine talent and interest in this quieter work, building something honest with his own hands, rather than simply inheriting fear and violence from his father's legacy. He also began spending time at Claire's clinic when his schedule allowed, initially simply waiting for her in the small reception area, but gradually finding himself drawn into helping in small, practical ways, repairing broken equipment, organizing supplies, even occasionally calming nervous fathers pacing anxiously in the waiting room, drawing on his own understanding of fear, disguised as steady composure. "You are surprisingly good with nervous, expectant fathers," Claire teased him one evening as they walked home together after a particularly long day. "I have had considerable practice appearing calm while feeling anything but," Damien replied dryly, though genuine warmth colored his voice. "It turns out the skill translates rather well to reassuring frightened men whose wives are in labor." Claire laughed, looping her arm through his as they walked. "I think you have found a rather unexpected second calling." "Perhaps," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Though I suspect the credit belongs mostly to you. I certainly never imagined myself here, in this particular version of my life, before that storm brought you crashing into it." Their evenings settled into a comfortable rhythm neither had previously known, quiet dinners prepared together, easy conversation, replacing the careful, guarded exchanges that once defined their earliest days. Claire watched, with quiet wonder, as the guarded, dangerous man from that first stormy night gradually revealed more and more of the person Ivy and Marta had always insisted lived beneath his careful control. Someone gentle, thoughtful, and surprisingly quick to laugh once he finally allowed himself the freedom to do so. Ivy visited often, little Grace growing more curious and mobile with each passing month, her bright laughter filling their new home with warmth Claire had never quite expected to find in this unexpected chapter of her life. Marta had become something between a mother figure and a dear friend, insisting on teaching Claire family recipes passed down through generations, filling their kitchen with rich, comforting smells that made the house feel less like a hideaway and more like a true home. Claire continued her work at the clinic, though with considerably less danger surrounding her daily life now that the territory war had finally settled. She had grown close with several of the mothers she worked with, watching new families form and grow with the same steady devotion she had always brought to her work, though now she returned each evening to a home filled with quiet, steady love, rather than solitary silence. That morning, as she prepared coffee in their sunlit kitchen, Damien appeared in the doorway, sleep still heavy in his eyes, watching her with the same soft, unguarded expression that had become so familiar over the past months, an expression she still occasionally marveled at, remembering the guarded, dangerous man who had first dragged her from her home in the middle of a storm. "Good morning," he said, crossing the room to press a gentle kiss against her temple. "Good morning," Claire replied, leaning into him briefly, before returning her attention to the coffee. "You have an early meeting with Leo today?" "Just a brief check-in," Damien said. "Mostly a formality at this point. He hardly needs my input anymore, though he insists on the courtesy regardless." Claire smiled, familiar warmth spreading through her chest at how easily this new rhythm had settled between them, how naturally danger had given way to simple, steady partnership. "You sound almost disappointed." "A little," Damien admitted, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. "Though mostly I am grateful. I spent so many years believing that life meant nothing except duty and danger. I did not realize how much I was missing until you showed me otherwise." They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, the easy quiet of two people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel connected, before Damien reluctantly excused himself for his meeting, promising to return well before evening. Claire spent her morning at the clinic, the familiar rhythm of appointments and checkups grounding her firmly in the ordinary, peaceful life she had once feared might never truly be possible again. That evening, Damien returned earlier than expected, a strange, nervous energy radiating from him that Claire immediately noticed the moment he walked through the door. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting aside the book she had been reading. Everything is fine, Damien said, though his hands were oddly restless as he moved to sit beside her. I simply have something I would like to discuss with you. Claire's heart quickened slightly at his tone, though not with fear this time, something entirely different stirring in her chest instead. All right. Damien took a steadying breath, reaching for her hands, holding them carefully within his own. The night I met you, he began, I dragged you from your home in the middle of a storm, terrified you, put you directly into danger without asking your permission or explaining myself properly. You had every reason to hate me, to run the moment the danger passed, and instead, you stayed. You fought for my family, for me, even when staying meant risking your own safety again and again. Damien, Claire said softly, her eyes already beginning to fill with unexpected tears. I spent years believing love was a weakness I could not afford, he continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. You proved me entirely wrong. You showed me that the truest strength I have ever known came not from fear or violence, but from choosing, again and again, to stay beside someone, even when staying was difficult, even when it was dangerous. He shifted slightly, and Claire's breath caught as she realized what was happening, watching him lower himself carefully before her, a small velvet box appearing from his pocket, his hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly now. Claire Bennett, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you walked into my life during the worst storm I had ever known, and somehow, impossibly, you brought more light into it than I ever thought I deserved. I do not want to build this new, quieter life without you standing beside me every single day. Will you marry me? Tears spilled freely down Claire's cheeks now, her heart so full she could hardly find her voice at first. Yes, she finally managed, laughing through her tears. Yes, of course, yes. Damien slid the ring onto her finger with hands that finally steadied, before rising to pull her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that held every ounce of the journey that had brought them here, from that first terrifying night to this quiet, joyful moment months later. I love you, he murmured against her hair, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone. I love you too, Claire whispered back, holding him close. I have loved you since that very first storm, even when I was far too afraid to admit it. They stayed there together for a long while, wrapped in quiet, overwhelming happiness, the danger and darkness that once defined Damien's world feeling impossibly distant now, replaced instead by the steady, certain promise of a future neither of them had ever expected to find. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a happy blur of preparation, Marta insisting on overseeing much of the planning herself, delighted to finally have a joyful occasion to organize after so many years of quieter, more cautious celebrations. Ivy helped Claire choose her dress, laughing over the sheer number of options before settling on something simple and elegant. Nothing like the grand, ostentatious affairs Claire imagined might have once defined events within Damien's old world. He would have hated a large, showy wedding, Ivy told her, smiling as she adjusted the fabric along Claire's shoulders. That was always his father's way, using every occasion to display power and wealth. Damien has spent his whole adult life trying not to become his father. This is exactly the kind of wedding he actually wants, something real, surrounded by people who matter, rather than people who simply need impressing. Claire found comfort in her words, any lingering nerves about the day settling into quiet excitement instead. She had chosen a small garden venue not far from their home, simple string lights woven through the trees, rows of modest chairs facing a flower-covered arch, rather than anything grand or elaborate. It felt right, she thought, a celebration built around genuine happiness rather than spectacle. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and warm, sunlight spilling generously across the garden as guests began arriving in the early evening for the ceremony. Claire stood in a small room just off the garden, Marta fussing gently with her hair, while Ivy adjusted the final details of her dress, both women beaming with an emotion that felt almost maternal in its warmth. You look beautiful, dear, Marta said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I have known that boy since he was barely old enough to walk, and I have never once seen him as happy as he has been these past months with you. Thank you, Marta, Claire said softly, her own eyes threatening to spill over despite her best efforts to preserve her careful makeup. For everything. For welcoming me so completely into this family. You made yourself family the night you saved Ivy and little Grace, Marta replied firmly. Everything since has simply been us catching up to what we already knew. Ivy squeezed her hand gently, little Grace babbling happily nearby, in her own small dress chosen specifically for the occasion. Ready? Ivy asked, and Claire, taking one final steadying breath, nodded. Months later, on a warm summer evening entirely free of storms, Claire stood surrounded by the people who had become her family, Ivy and little Grace, now toddling confidently between the gathered guests, Marta beaming with quiet pride, Leo standing steady and respectful near the edges of the celebration. Damien waited for her beneath a simple arch of flowers, his eyes never once leaving her as she walked toward him, and Claire felt, with absolute certainty, that every frightening moment of their unexpected story had led them exactly here, to this steady, joyful ending neither of them had dared hope for on that first stormy night so long ago. Damien's eyes glistened as she reached him, his hand trembling slightly as he took hers, the same hands that had once handled danger and violence with such steady precision, now holding hers as though she were the most precious thing he had ever been trusted to protect. "You look incredible," he murmured, just for her to hear. "You are not so bad yourself," Claire whispered back, a teasing smile breaking through her own overwhelming emotion. As they exchanged their vows beneath the golden evening light, Claire thought back to the terrified young woman who had been dragged from her kitchen into a night of violence and fear, and she marveled at how far that same woman had traveled since, not simply surviving the storm that had upended her life, but finding within it the truest, steadiest kind of love she had ever known. When they finally sealed their vows with a kiss, the small gathered crowd erupted into warm applause, little Grace clapping enthusiastically despite not fully understanding the occasion, and Claire felt herself laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the sheer, uncomplicated joy of the moment. Leo approached them first, once the ceremony concluded, offering Damien a rare, genuine smile. "I believe congratulations are in order," Leo said, shaking Damien's hand firmly before turning to Claire. "Take care of him. He deserves this happiness more than he usually allows himself to believe." "I intend to," Claire promised, smiling warmly at the man who had become such a steady, trusted presence throughout their entire unlikely story. The celebration continued late into the evening, laughter and warm conversation filling the garden long after the sun had fully set, string lights glowing softly overhead, in place of the storm clouds that had once defined the beginning of their story. Claire danced with Damien beneath those gentle lights, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. The storm had long since passed. What remained, standing steady and unshaken beside her, was something far better than anything the calm had ever promised. A love strong enough to survive danger, patient enough to rebuild an entire life, and steady enough to last well beyond any storm that might still come their way.